Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar on how President Trump's fiscal year 19 budget request could impact affordable housing and community development programs. As I'm sure most of you have heard at this point, President Trump has again proposed devastating cuts to federal affordable housing programs, and we want to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information and how you could advocate against these proposals. This webinar is being hosted by the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, or as we call it, CHCDF. CHCDF is an education strategy and action hub. The coalition, which includes more than 70 national organizations, works to ensure the highest allocation of resources possible to support affordable housing and community development programs. CHCDF members represent a full continuum of national housing and community development organizations. A few housekeeping announcements. We will be recording this webinar, and we'll send you the recording shortly after the webinar concludes. And if you have any questions, please be sure to ask them through the webinar feature on the right of your screen. Given our packed agenda, I'm going to jump right in and introduce our panelists today, as well as today's agenda.
Elaine, this is Joey. I'm going to interrupt briefly just so we can fix a presentation issue on your screens. One moment.
Sorry about that technical issue. So we're going to get started again. Speaking today on our webinar is Doug Rice from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Linda Couch from Leading Age, and Joey Lindstrom from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We will provide a budget overview, and that includes both fiscal year 18, which we are now in, and fiscal year 19. And how the budget request for fiscal year 19 will impact various HUD programs, as well as opportunities for advocacy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Rice from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
I have to unmute. Hi, everyone. I'm going to move pretty quickly, but I'd be happy to answer questions at the end or even by email at some later time. Elaine, if you could just go to the next slide. Okay, so important background to the president's budget is the fact that a couple of weeks ago, Congress passed and the president signed into law a 2-year budget agreement that effectively raised the rigid spending caps on both defense programs and non-defense discretionary programs. And that latter category is the category that includes most HUD programs and other programs that are funded annually by Congress. So a couple of details. I'll talk about details of the caps in a sec. I guess, this budget deal has a couple of important implications. First and foremost, it really clears the way for Congress to negotiate a final omnibus spending bill for fiscal year 2018, which they plan to do between now and March 23rd. But it also sets a top-line funding level for defense and also for non-defense programs for fiscal year 2019. It's also important. Does this mean, given that Congress has already agreed to overall spending levels for 2018 and 2019, does this mean that the president's budget request is not meaningful in any way? And I think it's a mistake to believe that. For one, the president is the leader of his party, and the budget is very much a visionary document. It sets the administration's spending and policy priorities, not just for 2019, but for many years beyond. And it really sets the tone in many ways on budget and other kinds of fiscal discussions on the Hill, and it sets the tone in a way that I think will energize certain reactionary forces on the Hill, which will make it all much more difficult for us. So, bottom line is, I think that while the president's specific funding proposals, many of them are not that is at program level. Many of them are not likely to receive serious attention from Congress. Overall, it will make it more difficult to secure adequate funding for HUD and other safety net programs, given the priorities that are set out in the budget and given how austere the budget is. All right, let's move on to the next one. So this is a picture of what the two-year budget agreement did. The blue lines are the non-defense discretionary funding levels in the under the original Budget Control Act. The orange bars shows you the changes that were made in those levels. So for 2018, basically the cap on non-defense programs is increased by $63 billion up to $579 billion. And in 2019, the cap is raised by $68 billion up to $597 billion. Those are significant increases. The big question for us, of course, is in 2018, for example, of this $63 billion, how much of it will go to HUD programs? And we're going to have to wait several weeks to find out. Okay, next slide, please. Just a quick aside here. The budget caps, as you all know, have been in place since 2011 and have had a severe effect on HUD programs. The caps have really cut funding overall for non-defense discretionary programs by actually 13% in inflation-adjusted terms from 2010 to 2017. And in the HUD budget, which is 85% rental assistance, and the cost of renewing that rental assistance goes up every year, this has really forced some difficult choices. And hardest hit in the last several years as a result of the caps have been public housing and the two block grant programs, CDBG and Home. As you can see in this chart, those areas have seen the deepest cuts in recent years. Okay, next slide, please. Just to note, even though the budget caps the budget deal will free up significant additional resources for non-defense programs in 2018 and 2019, it's worth pointing out that overall spending in these areas will still remain below the 2010 level adjusted for inflation, and that's what this chart shows here. All right, next one, please. Okay, so moving on to the President's 2019 budget request. In many respects, it looks a lot like the 2018 request. It continues the drive to repeal, replace, cut Medicaid and other kinds of subsidies that help low and moderate income households afford insurance, health insurance. It proposes deep cuts in basic assistance programs like SNAP or food stamps, as well as housing assistance programs. And of course, at the bottom, it does nothing to change the recently enacted tax law, which will reduce federal revenues by well over $1 trillion over the next decade, and maybe as much as $2 trillion. So one thing I will note, as far as the deep cuts in non-defense discretionary funding, it's worth noting that even though the President just signed a 2-year budget deal to raise the non-defense discretionary caps for 2018 and 2019, the amount of funding for non-defense programs that is proposed in the President's budget for 29 is actually well below that cap level, $57 billion below the level agreed to in the bipartisan agreement. Okay, next slide, please. Well, what does that all mean for HUD? So this is just a quick summary of what the President has proposed. Overall, there's $41.2 billion in new funding for HUD programs. This includes $2 billion that was added at the last minute. Some of you may have heard that after the President signed the 2-year budget deal into law, the White House moved quickly to compile a list of additional funding requests to include in its budget submission, which had already gone to the printer weeks in advance. Those additional submissions included about $2 billion in additional funds for HUD programs. And so the figures here all take that into account. So taking that into account, there's $41 billion for HUD. That's $6.8 billion below the 2017 level, not counting losses due to inflation, or about a 14% reduction. So really massive cuts. The amount requested for vouchers, we think, based on our analysis, is $1.9 billion less than is likely to be needed to renew all vouchers that families are currently using. That would leave approximately 200,000 housing vouchers without renewal funds next year. For Section 8 project-based rental assistance, the requested amount is $300 million below the 2018 estimated renewal need level, and of course even further below what's likely to be needed in 2019 after you take rent inflation and other factors into account. So a significant shortfall there too. Again, the administration has proposed really massive cuts in public housing funding, almost half. The budget eliminates the capital fund and makes huge reductions in operating funds for public housing. On the side, the budget request does include an additional $100 million for rental assistance demonstration conversions, which is an important tool for that enables housing authorities to rehab their public housing developments by converting their public housing funding contracts to Section 8 contracts. But RAD conversions are not going to work, even with these additional funds, in a context in which really deep cuts to public housing funding overall would be made. So, in addition, the budget proposes, again, to eliminate the HOME program, as well as community development block grants, Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, and the National Housing Trust Fund. And in addition, the budget includes a host of policy proposals, some of which reflect proposals made in the 2018 budget, but some of which are new. Like last year, there's a proposal to raise rents on assisted tenants, though there's some changes this year, and I'll talk a little more about those in a sec. But the request for the first time also includes a work requirement proposal. I think it's fair to say that this request is probably the most radical, proposes the most radical retrenchment of federal aid for renters in 80 years, really since the U.S. Housing Act was signed into law in 1937. Next slide, please. So this table shows funding levels for major programs. We made an effort to allocate these addendum amounts to particular accounts. In the addendum itself, some of these amounts were clear. There was out of the $2 billion, there was $300 million for public housing and an additional $700 million for housing vouchers. But there was $1 billion that was added basically to protect elderly and disabled households from rent increases that would result from the policy proposals included in the budget. And what we did is, based on our analysis of the rent policy proposals, we estimated how that $1 billion would be distributed, and so that's included in the table here too. I'll just add a caveat to that. Today we just got word on the details of how HUD intends to allocate that $1 billion, and the amounts are similar in some respects, but a little bit different. So just keep that in mind when you look at these numbers. Okay, next slide, please. So a bit more about the rent policy proposals. So there's really not all that much detailed information about the rent policy proposals in the budget request itself. Now, several weeks ago, a preliminary draft that really was detailed, so full legislative language, was leaked, and we've all taken a look at it. The language that was included in the budget that was released is much more general, though entirely consistent with the leaked detailed language that we saw several weeks ago, with one major exception, and that is that at the last minute, as I said, HUD decided to hold seniors and people with disabilities harmless from the rent policy proposals and add back $1 billion to the budget request to make up for that. But other than that, our working assumption is that that what HUD intends to do is very much like what's in the leaked document that we've seen. And there's, if you're interested, there's a lot of some detailed information up on our website about those proposals. But here are some basics. So for non-elderly, non-disabled households, HUD is proposing again to increase their rents from 30% to 35% of their income, as well as to eliminate child care and other kinds of deductions. Really substantial increases in basic rents for assisted households who are not elderly or disabled. In addition, there's a minimum rent proposal that would set minimum rents at the equivalent of 35% of wages working 15 hours a week at minimum wage, which we calculate to be about $152 a month. Really a huge increase in the rents that the poorest HUD-assisted households would have to pay. For seniors and people with disabilities, as I said, HUD seems intent on excluding them from most of the rent proposals. It's a little unclear the way the leaked language read, whether there would be changes to minimum rent or not. And then there's a kind of a complex set of other kinds of proposals as well that I don't have time to go into, such as eliminating flat rents. It includes hardship provisions that are like current law, basically, as well as really sweeping authority for HUD to set whatever alternative rent policies it wanted to. So, in addition, there's the work requirement. It's an optional provision, so HUD would have authority to allow housing authorities and private owners of project-based Section 8 units to impose mandatory work requirements on residents, though it would be up to housing authorities or owners if they wanted to do it. HUD, the leaked proposal suggests that such requirements could require work up to 32 hours per week and would have to include certain limited kinds of training or education activities as well as work, but certainly significant burden. Next slide, please. Okay, so on our preliminary analysis, just the rent policy proposals themselves would have a huge impact on assisted tenants. Basically, it shifts huge costs from the federal government onto assisted households. We estimate that overall rents would rise by well over $2 billion on 1.8 million assisted households. These households include 3 million kids. The average rent increase for affected households would be about $120 a month. So when you think about an average assisted household currently pays $300 or $400 a month on average, they would see a really substantial increase in that rent payment. There are other reasons to be concerned about these proposals. Some of them would actually discourage, despite the language in the budget that says that HUD's goal here is to encourage more households to increase their work hours and their incomes. Some of them would actually discourage work by increasing the penalty for working. If you increase your income and have to provide a share of your increased income in the form of increased rent under the rules, and currently that share is 30%. If it goes up to 35% of gross income, then the so-called penalty for increasing your income is actually worsened. And of course, these rent increases largely would fall on the poorest households, and especially the minimum rent increase. I will note too another fact that the administration, proposes these rent increases in part as a justification for some of the very deep funding cuts that they're proposing. Basically, they're saying, look, we don't need as much money for these programs in 2019 because we're going to ask tenants to pay more. I think realistically, it's exceedingly unlikely that any of these changes, even if Congress were to go along with them, that any of them could be approved by Congress and then written into federal regulations in time to be in place for the 2019 budget year. So that's just not going to work out. Next slide, please. And then there's the work proposal. So unfortunately, these would add significant burdens to assisted households. It's important to keep in mind that 90% of, or almost 90% of HUD-assisted households are either seniors, people with disabilities, or people who are already working or recently worked significant hours. So, work effort largely is a problem that is small in the world of HUD programs, and yet work requirements would add significant burdens to these households. So, the ones who would be affected most are ones who are working, but because of the jobs they have, they may work volatile hours or working part-time, and they could be at risk of losing their assistance, for example, if their employer reduces their hours for a couple of weeks. There's also, while we all have an interest in helping HUD-assisted households to improve their employment and earnings, an important way of doing that is providing them with support to build their skills and experience. And there's really no resources in this budget request to do that. So it's really imposing a harsh, burdensome requirement without providing any resources to support families in their efforts to improve their education and gain some new skills that will help them on the job market. In addition, there are a significant number of households who struggle with mental health or physical health, chronic physical health problems that limit their ability to work, but that don't qualify them as being fully disabled, and they're at risk of losing their assistance. And finally, I'll just note that the hard research evidence that exists on work requirements is pretty limited, but to the extent that it exists, it shows that work requirements themselves have, at best, marginal gains in employment and earnings for assisted households. These gains tend to shrink significantly over time, and yet, on the other hand, at least in the welfare world, in which we saw a shift to work requirements in the mid-1990s, one consequence of that is that the poorest households that have the greatest barriers to working in the job market because they have poor educations, poor skills, and so on, the consequences for them are much more likely to be that they simply lose their assistance and fall into very deep poverty rather than succeeding on the job market. And so while we do think it's important to do what we can to help HUD-assisted tenants improve their employment and earnings, there are better ways of doing it, such as, and we have a couple of good examples in the HUD world, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, the Jobs Plus programs. These are two two programs that have shown really promising results by providing financial incentives to work for assisted households, as well as various kinds of support. But they're currently operating on a really small scale, and we really ought to be looking at expanding those rather than imposing harsh work requirements.
Thanks so much, Doug, for that overview of the budget. Some pretty bleak stuff. Next up, we have Linda Couch from Leading Age to talk about the impact of the budget request on specific HUD programs.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Doug. I'm just going to dig in a little bit more on what the FY19 request means for affordable housing programs. Next slide. I thought this quote was relevant and spot on for our discussion today and for the year's worth of advocacy ahead. This is a statement from NARO, from Adrienne Todman, their executive director. It is difficult to comprehend how out of touch this budget is. And I think you heard a lot of that from Doug, and the slides in my portion of the presentation, I think, will only reinforce that quote. On the Housing Choice Voucher Program, Doug talked about the 200,000 vouchers that CBPP estimates will not be in use next year if the HUD request were to be enacted. So, I just want people to understand that, what these losses really mean in their communities. These are numbers that I pulled really easily from HUD's picture of subsidized households. There are other resources on HUD's website where you can figure out how many vouchers does my local housing authority have. But these are real families in real cities across the country that simply won't be assisted next year if HUD's budget were to be enacted. And of course, we know in the voucher program that any cuts this year to vouchers leased up, vouchers in use, result in reduction in funding next year. Housing authorities FY20 or 2020 voucher money will be based on their number of vouchers in use in 2019. And so if it goes down in 19, it'll certainly go down in 20, and you get really in this downward spiral of funding. Another reason why an inadequate voucher request is potentially really damaging. For the project-based rental assistance program, HUD's second largest rental assistance program, the $300 million at least shortfall in the FY19 request is equally problematic for that program. In addition to not seeking initially enough funds, HUD requests language that would allow the HUD secretary to freeze rents to owners. So without regard to whatever statutes say or the contracts owners have with HUD to provide rental assistance to low-income residents, the secretary is seeking authority from Congress to freeze rents to owners. That coupled with the shortfall could be really problematic and difficult for owners, make it difficult for owners to stay in the program. We've seen shortfalls in the Section 8 in the project-based Section 8 program, over the last many years, and it really has gone to HUD to decide how to implement those shortfalls. We have seen HUD short-time contracts, and so instead of issuing 12-month contracts, HUD instead issues a 6-month contract or a 9-month contract. That could happen. Last year in FY17, when there was a potential shortfall in the PRAC program, HUD put out there that maybe owners could figure out on their own how to make up for the shortfall in those project rental assistance contracts associated with Section 202 communities. I also think that, this is pretty cynical, but, part of the strategy could be forced attrition or, just a shrinking of the PBRA portfolio as owners leave the program on their own because of distrust of HUD and instability in funding for the program. So I think, it's really important that we we focus on these programs, we focus on each of them because every community has some amount of public housing vouchers and project-based Section 8. In the public housing program, the smallest of three of HUD's largest programs, I think that the cuts are obviously the worst. Everyone saw over the winter multiple media reports, not just in New York City, but in other places where the systems that make our public housing operate are failing, and the backlog and capital repair needs is really catching up with the physical properties. But instead of offering and requesting new capital, or at least level funding of the Public Housing Capital Fund, HUD requested a zeroing out for FY19 of the Public Housing Capital Fund, and spells out its vision to, shift public housing to the Section 8 platform. But as Doug said, that's really impossible when HUD is asking for 47% less for public housing. RAD works and has support in Congress really because it is a budget neutral program. So if a public housing unit converts to the Section 8 platform under RAD, not only does the public housing unit become a Section 8 unit, but the public housing dollars become Section 8 dollars and move into the Section 8 account. But shifting public housing into Section 8 without sufficient public housing funding is immediately unworkable. And I think it's a pretty see-through approach that HUD is taking to chart the end of public housing in the country. In the 202 and 811 programs, we see requests that are less than both what HUD is on course to receive in FY18 from the House and Senate bills. And again, these are without the addendum. We haven't seen exactly how the addendum is going to be divvied up. So maybe we'll see additional funds go into those programs. But absent details from the addendum, we have two accounts here, the 202 elderly and the 811 housing for persons with disabilities accounts that underfunds contract renewals for owners, underfunds renewals for Section 811 mainstream vouchers, likely provides insufficient service coordinator funding, not to mention doesn't expand service coordinators to communities who don't have them, and does nothing to expand options for people with disabilities and seniors to live with independence in communities of their choice. And I think this is one place where we were really hopeful that we had a HUD secretary as a physician who might see this connection between housing and healthcare and do as much as possible to make those connections happen. The homeless assistance grants request in the FY9 request is flat with FY17 funding. This, when HUD's own report that was released in December shows the homeless population nationally rising for the first time in many years. In addition to flat funding or requesting a flat funding of homeless assistance, the request would eliminate the U.S. Interagency Council on homelessness. And this is the federal agency that I really credit with being the first federal agency to say, you know what, we're going to end homelessness, and here's a plan to do that. I think, we can say, okay, the National Alliance on Homelessness, they said, why don't you do this? But, they took it on, and they were the federal agency that said in 2010 that, we can have a plan to get the number of homeless people in the United States to zero. And it would be a huge loss to strategies to end homelessness across all populations if we did not have the USICH. And then, as Doug mentioned, the state and local resource loss is pretty significant in the HUD budget request. And these are things that came up last year, but I think they're made even more damaging to state and local governments because they search to find ways to address their shortages of housing because of the tax reform bill that was passed by Congress in December. What we saw with the lowering of the corporate tax rate was a lowering of pricing and production in the low-income housing tax credit program, and the loss of 14, 15, 16% of tax credit value, tax credit production, coupled with losing the home program, the trust fund program, CDBG, as you really see this full-on retrenchment of HUD from being in the housing and community development business. My next slide, I wanted to include, I'm not expecting anyone to really, we're not going to go through the details here, but I want you to look at all the red on the left-hand columns. And where you see red is where HUD is requesting for FY19 reductions in the salaries and expenses, the administration arms of those program offices. So you have support offices and then program offices, so public and Indian housing, community planning and development, which is where home and CDBG and the homeless programs are, housing, PD&R, fair housing, healthy housing. You see a lot of red there. And where you don't see red is that top executive offices line, because lo and behold, the HUD secretary has seen fit to increase the salaries and expenses line item for his office. There's something not quite right about this when you're cutting off assistance for potentially hundreds of thousands of people. And then all told, there are overall challenges that are presented by the request. We are going to have to spend a lot of our lobbying time and our advocacy time, and we'll be asking the field to do the same, talking about how bad these rent reforms are, how damaging the work requirements would be, instead of talking to them about the need to increase and expand and improve these programs. We're also, I think, squandering an opportunity to increase funding for HUD that could be possible under the CAPS deal. Well, certainly the administration is. This is a time where we could really take advantage of some of that expanded non-defense discretionary cap to make the case for investing in programs that are going to help our communities better meet their needs. And then finally, and this would be the worst case scenario, is that we're in a situation where, programs that, serve in general low-income people have all been targeted for either big cuts or elimination in the FY19 request. And so you're really beginning to pit programs and populations against one another. Food stamps, low-income home energy assistance, social services block grants, community services block grants, Medicaid are all being, requested for cuts in addition to the HUD requests. So, it's important that we remember that all these programs, knit together the fabric that low-income people need. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thank you, Linda, for that great overview of how these cuts will impact specific programs. And I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's joining us today on this webinar so that you can be well informed and ready to take action as federal housing programs are under attack, as Doug noted, in the most significant way in the past 80 years. So my first slide really just starts out with what our ask is to members of Congress right now. And it's very simple. Ask Congress to ensure housing and community development programs receive the highest level of funding possible in FY18 and FY19. And the additional aspect of this slide is something that you already heard both Doug and Linda talk about, which is it's not enough for us to simply protect these programs from cuts. But we need to make the affirmative argument that they also need to be expanded with more funding. So we can't ignore the president's very draconian budget that slashes so many of these programs. So we need to point out the importance of the programs, as we always do, and then suggest why they can achieve more, the programs, with expanded funding. So it's all about expand, don't cut important affordable housing and community development programs. As I talk about the best ways to deliver the message, you'll find that some of these are things that, we've talked to you a lot about before, and some of them might be somewhat new. So to start with the oldies, you'll definitely want to, if you can, bring up these important programs in direct meetings with your members of Congress, right? There are a couple of opportunities to do that in the near future. And first, I'd like to highlight that many of the coalition members of the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding will be having their conferences here in DC over the next couple of months. And indeed, many of the national organizations intentionally schedule their conferences for the spring portion of the year, specifically because they, like we do at NLIHC, incorporate a lobby day aspect to the conferences, and they want to do so during the period of the year when the budget is being most sort of hotly discussed and worked on, and before a lot of the House and Senate appropriations are fully cooked or even partially cooked in some cases. So to the extent that you can get yourself to DC to participate in these events, please think about doing so. But don't miss an opportunity to meet with your members of Congress when they are at home. We are currently in the President's Day district work period, which ends on Sunday of this week. District work period is the preferred term for recess. Members of Congress don't like to call it recess. They want you to know they are still working, just at home. So district work period actually is oftentimes a really good opportunity to meet face-to-face with your members of Congress, or to find them at events that they already have planned. They might be town hall events, they might be meet and greet events, or press conferences that they're doing. There might be opportunities for you to ask them a question and get them to go on record about their support of essential housing programs. Remember, if you're new to lobbying, we at NLIHC are committed to helping you have the data and the tools and the training that you need to do so confidently. We can also provide, and our partners through CHCDF can provide talking points for any upcoming meetings that you have. If it's not possible to interact with your members of Congress during this district work period, please be aware that the next district work period will be March 24th through April 8th, which coincides with the Easter and Passover holidays this year in 2018. The next best way to interact with your members of Congress is to send emails. Emails keep a good record, and they're easily forwardable. They're easily things that can be tallied, but we always encourage you to target specific staff people at your congressperson's office whenever you can. So if you can reach out to the budget or housing, or rather budget and housing staff people when sending these emails, that's a lot better than just sending the email to a general office account, of course. If you need any information finding out who those staff people are for your particular senators and representative, feel free to reach out to us on the field team here at NLIHC. That's just outreach@nlihc.org, and we'd be happy to look up that information for you. After emails, it's also great to call your members of Congress. And when calling, I would reiterate, talking to specific staffers will usually get you the best sort of mileage. When you're having a conversation with them, they can ask you questions in real time, or you can leave voicemails, which are obviously very helpful. In general, we encourage you to build on previous relationships that you have with staff members in given offices. The people who have met with you before might need a lot less background information, and you might be able to more quickly get to the meat of your ask, as it were. We also encourage everyone to interact with their members of Congress on Twitter and other social media. It's becoming very clear that members of Congress track their social media very closely, especially Twitter, and will oftentimes interact with advocates over Twitter. So I really encourage you to explore the best ways to sort of follow and mention and directly interact with your members of Congress through social media. Our next considerations for delivering the message first are about focusing on appropriations committees. Please contact your members of Congress regardless of what committees they're on. But if you work in an area where your representative or your senators are on the respective appropriations committees, those will be particularly important. You'll want to share information about programs in your community that rely on federal funding. And this will always be especially important because it can crystallize for the staffers why the funding matters so particularly. Then I want to transition to something that we didn't talk about in last year's webinar, which is using the upcoming elections as an opportunity to deliver your message about the importance of housing affordability. You can participate in town hall meetings or candidate forums. You can produce candidate questionnaires and share those responses of those questionnaires publicly on your website or through a blog and so forth. You can also invite elected officials and candidates to tour your programs, whether you're a service provider or a housing developer or a community center. These tours can often be accepted by them because they provide good photo ops, but it's also an opportunity for you to provide good additional information about the importance of these programs. I put a photo on this slide of a recent mayoral forum, candidates in Atlanta talking about affordable housing. And remember, there are always ways for you to seize the moment in an election to get more and more attention to the essential issue of affordable housing and community development programs. Other steps you can take include signing on to the CHCDF budget letter. That's the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, our budget letter that we do every year. Last year's letter included 3,467 organizational signers. So that's more than 3,000 groups throughout the country who committed to affordable housing programs being a priority in the budget. It's definitely true that we are in the midst of what I'm starting to call sign-on letter season. You'll see this CHCDF budget letter, which is broadly about all housing and community development programs. You're likely going to see other sign-on letters that might be about any given program that matters a lot to any given organization at the national level. Please do sign on. The broad letter that I'm speaking of has a deadline of March 16th, and there's a link on this slide for where you can go to sign the letter. Beyond our letter that we're delivering to members of Congress, representatives and senators are lobbying one another to make sure that the programs that they care most deeply about are prioritized in the final budget amounts. And so what they do is they circulate Dear Colleague letters to one another, urging for specific funding amounts for specific programs. These Dear Colleague letters, those that relate to federal housing programs, are really strengthened when there's a large number of representatives and senators who sign on. These letters are currently being drafted, so look forward to a future call to action in which we let you know which letters are available and when the best moment is to reach out to your members of Congress about signing on. And another way that you can take action is through the Our Homes, Our Voices National Housing Week of Action, which this year will take place May 1st to May 8th. Thank you to all of you who participated in our events in July of last year. We're moving it up this year because we think this might be a more regular budget calendar, but maybe we're wrong about that. But moving it up definitely puts us on safer ground. Last year, there were more than 60 local events, and they range in type from large-scale rallies to the small-scale community teach-ins. And really, for those of you who might consider hosting a local event, the best thing to know is we're happy to work with you and provide resources regardless of the size and scale of your event. For those of you who are with national organizations, please do share information about Week of Action within your networks because this will obviously have the largest impact when it's being sort of celebrated throughout the country, and that communities from coast to coast are calling for more funding for affordable housing programs. At the bottom, you see the website for Our Homes, Our Voices, where you can learn more about information, or where you can learn more about the event and get more information. But I'd like to point your attention to just a few resources that we make available through our communications team and through Elaine, who's done so much of the planning, that we make available to everyone hosting an event. And that includes several sample materials, including posters, postcards that can be mailed to elected officials, sample social media images and tweets, talking points and press releases, sample letters to invite local elected officials or congressional elected officials, and general assistance in promoting the event within our network in your communities. So please consider being more and more involved as we get closer to the week of action, which now is really only 2.5 months away, or 3 months away actually. So we're getting close, and we really hope that we have as much participation as possible so that we can have a successful event like we did last year in 2017. And I'll turn it back over to Elaine.
Thanks so much, Joe. And we have really awesome T-shirts as well to go along with the event.
Yeah, forgot the T-shirts. You're right.
Well, so it looks like we have a couple minutes for questions. Tori, have we gotten any questions?
Yes, we have a few questions from folks on the call. Thank you. We have one question about what we mean by freezing rents and what an example of that would look like.
Linda, I think
Hi,
that's for
this is
you.
Linda. I can take it. Our understanding of what HUD means by when it says to freeze rents to owners is that normally in, say, a project-based Section 8 contract, the owner can request that HUD raise its contract rents by, whatever is justified, 2, 3, 4% a year, and HUD does that to allow owners to pay their operating costs, pay their, fund capital needs as they occur, and the ability to seek those rent adjustments are spelled out in contracts owners have with HUD, and that's the authority that HUD is asking Congress for, is to allow the Secretary not to make those rent increases to owners.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what experiences are coming from cities who have taken on the RAD program? Are the residents stable or losing their housing? And aren't Baltimore public housing residents in RAD buildings asserting that they were improperly evicted?
Linda or Doug?
Yeah, I guess I haven't followed the public housing side of RAD, and I've been focused on the 202 side of RAD, which is, transferring from one private owner to another private owner, and not, I think it's a little different than the public housing to Section 8 transfer. So I can't speak to what's happened in Baltimore.
This is Joey with the field team at NLIHC. We can follow up with more information about that specific question. I will say, when we've gotten questions specific to RAD, we often find them a little bit difficult to answer because there's been sort of scarce reporting on what's happening with the earliest RAD deals and so forth. But we can find information specific to Baltimore and shoot an email to you with an answer to that question.
Great. We have a question about if we could clarify the amount of salary or budget increase for the HUD Executive Office.
Yeah, let me find it in my slides here. So what did the person want to know?
The increase?
Yeah.
So the increase in the HUD Executive Office would be an increase, I think it was 1.6, almost about 1.6, 1.67 billion dollars.
We have a question. Do you think the RAD proposal is a signal to get PHAs to switch to RAD now before lower capital and operational budgets are locked in?
Well, it's hard. That would be impossible right now because the RAD for public housing conversions is capped at a certain number of units, and that cap has been met. I understand there's a waiting list for housing authorities to convert under RAD. So I do think that there's a lot of housing authorities that would like to convert, if they were given the same, at least the same budget. But this request, encourages conversion largely without the budget. I don't know, Doug, if you want to say anything about that.
No, I think that's right. I don't think there's any special incentive here. Both the RAD money and any change to the RAD cap would have to be approved by Congress. So it's not like agencies can move forward at this point in the absence of congressional action.
I think we have time for one last question.
Okay, the one last question, can you speak to the proposal to eliminate medical deductions from adjusted rent calculations?
Yeah. Well, that's sort of in this gray area that we don't know what HUD plans to do, right? So on the one hand, the leaked documents suggested that all deductions would be eliminated. On the other hand, the addendum says that they intend to protect seniors and people with disabilities from any impact of the rent changes. So to me, that implies that they are no longer proposing any change to medical deduction policy, but in the absence of a detailed final proposal, it's hard to be sure about that.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. As I said in the beginning of the webinar, we have been recording, and you will get an email with the recording as well as the slides. We will also include in that email some additional resources, including the letter that Joe mentioned during his presentation. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us here at NLIHC or Linda or Doug. Here's our contact information. Feel free to email us or tweet at us. We will do our best to answer your questions. And with that, we will end our webinar. Thanks, everybody, again, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Week, rather.